They adopted 10 children. No birth records, no school history, no medical files, no photographs before the age of 6, no questions asked. In the spring of 1946, the Hemsworths arrived in Briar Glen, a sleepy New England town still shaking off the ashes of war. They didn't host a welcome party. They didn't knock on doors. They simply appeared, moving into the long-abandoned Ashcroft estate at the edge of the woods, where the trees grew too thick and the road narrowed into silence. Harold Hemsworth introduced himself at the pharmacy as a neurologist. War medals, Harvard degree, quiet voice. Evelyn Hemsworth said even less. Well-dressed, gloved hands, always watching but never smiling. Within weeks, the townsfolk had categorized them the way small towns always do. Distant but respectable. A bit strange but harmless. And then, quietly, private people. Then came the children. The first boy appeared at Evelyn's side during Sunday Mass in July. Pale, slender, barely 8. Dressed in gray from collar to boots, he sat motionless for the entire service. His eyes never wandered. He didn't speak. No one knew his name. A month later, another child. Then another and another. By 1950, the Hemsworths had 10 children, each more ghost-like than the last. 10 identical uniforms. 10 identical haircuts. 10 sets of perfectly folded hands. And not one laugh. Not one word heard outside their property. They never enrolled in school. They never came to the town square. They didn't play, didn't run, didn't even seem to age. The house on Briar Glen Road became legend. Kids dared each other to throw stones at the gate. None stayed long enough to see if anyone came to the window. Adults whispered about refugees and charity, but even the most generous souls in town couldn't ignore what didn't make sense. Why were there never any birthdays? Why did the children never speak? Why, in a town of open arms and familiar faces, did none of them ever make a friend? One woman, a grocery clerk named Helen Pierce, claimed she saw one of the girls whisper something to herself in a language she didn't recognize. She told her husband, he told the bar. By morning, everyone knew the story, but no one believed it, or pretended not to. And then came the photograph. In May of 1952, Briar Glen Elementary hosted its annual spring fair. Open to the public. A photographer named Daniel Moore, known for cataloging every major town event, was snapping candids of the crowd. Children running, parents laughing, vendors smiling. But one image, buried deep in the negatives, stopped him cold. Behind the crowd, distant, almost spectral, stood the Hemsworth family. 10 children, standing in a perfect line, blank faces, uniform gray. Harold and Evelyn on either side, hands behind their backs, not interacting with the crowd, just watching. Moore didn't remember seeing them that day. He was sure of it. Yet there they were, etched in film. He developed the photo anyway, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he sent a copy to a friend in Boston, a former child welfare investigator named Ruth Levine. She called him 3 days later, shaking. "That girl," she said, "the fourth from the left. That's not an orphan." Moore didn't follow. "I worked with the Red Cross cases during the war," Ruth said. "That's Anna Lejeune, missing since 1943 from a Belgian refugee camp." Daniel Moore laughed at first, but Ruth wasn't joking. She had photographs, she had files. She sent them to the state police. Within a week, a car from the Boston office arrived in Briar Glen. Unmarked, quiet, 2 men in gray suits visited the Hemsworth home. They stayed for 3 hours. The next day, they were gone. No statements, No questions asked of neighbors, no follow-up. And then the photograph disappeared. Moore claimed someone broke into his darkroom. No signs of forced entry, but the negatives were gone. Every copy vanished. Every frame of the fair remained, except the one, and no one in town wanted to talk about it. Within months, the rumors grew darker. One of the Hemsworth children, the boy with the lopsided ear, stopped appearing at Sunday Mass. Then another vanished. When someone asked Evelyn where they'd gone, she smiled and said, "We've sent them home." What home? There were no adoption papers, no passports, no school registrations, no medical appointments, nothing tying these children to any country, any agency, any name. Just 10 gray uniforms. And now only 8 remained. By 1955, 3 children were gone. No death certificates, no police reports, just gone. And still, the town stayed silent. After all, the Hemsworths were generous. Harold donated to the hospital. Evelyn funded the church roof. They were quiet, polite, respectable. And strange things only grow darker when you look too long. But not everyone forgot. Daniel Moore, haunted by the photograph he could no longer prove existed, began keeping notes, descriptions, sketches. Names whispered between neighbors, etched into the margins of newspapers. He compiled every detail he could remember about the Hemsworth children, their faces, their heights, their unusual tics. He locked it all in a box beneath his floorboards. He died in 1972. His box was never found until 2013. When a renovation crew pulled up the floor of his former home, they found it. Sealed, labeled only with a single line. If you find this, ask one question. What happened to the children on Briar Glen Road? Dr. Harold Hemsworth was the kind of man who made people trust him without thinking. Tall, clean-cut, soft-spoken, he looked like the idea of safety. His handshake was firm but not aggressive. His voice held just enough weariness to imply wisdom, and just enough clarity to demand attention. Before Briar Glen, he'd been stationed at a neurological facility in New York. Before that, a classified post under the U.S. Army Medical Corps during the war. No one knew what exactly he did during his time abroad, but the medals in his study told their own story. So did the letters, signed by generals, surgeons, politicians, all thanking him for his contributions to cognitive medicine. Then there was Evelyn. She moved like she was born in a cathedral. Gloved hands, flawless posture, face always partially hidden beneath a black veil. Rumor said she had once been a missionary in Argentina, maybe even further. Some whispered Africa. But Evelyn never confirmed or denied the stories. She simply smiled and said, "Faith requires sacrifice." She attended Mass every Sunday without fail, sat in the front pew, never missed a charity event, and wrote checks that kept the church lights on through 2 harsh winters. Together, they were untouchable. So when they began bringing children into their home, 1 per year, no one asked too many questions. War orphans, Harold would say. Rescued from camps, lost families, Evelyn would add, sometimes placing a gentle hand on the child's shoulder. The children never spoke, but their silence was explained away. Trauma, foreign tongues, cultural shock. The town believed it. Why wouldn't they? After all, Harold donated to the Veterans Hall. He helped build the War Memorial. He gave lectures at the local college on neuroplasticity and recovery. Evelyn organized clothing drives for widows and ran Sunday school for the youngest parishioners. The Hemsworths were a model couple, refined, charitable, religious. What they weren't was questioned. The children came in stages. First came Edgar, then Beatrice, then Miriam, Anton, Jules, and Helen. each one pale, each one unnervingly quiet. They always appeared mid-year, no fanfare, already clothed in the same pressed gray uniform. Stiff collars, long sleeves, black boots. Never a variation. Never a speck of color. The children didn't go to school. That raised eyebrows at first. But Harold quickly explained they were catching up through private instruction. He claimed they had been educationally neglected, that public school would only re-traumatize them. Evelyn backed this up with Catholic pamphlets on home instruction, even offering to tutor other families' children. After that, no one brought it up again. Still, the signs were there, if anyone had looked. Each child walked with identical posture. No slouching, no head turning. Hands always at their sides, never swinging freely. Even their blinking seemed measured, timed, as if trained. A local girl named Janet once said she saw the Hemsworth children walking in a circle behind the house at sunset. They weren't playing, she said. They were rehearsing something. Her mother told her not to speak of it. At the 1951 town gala, Evelyn brought 5 of the children along, dressed identically, hair combed back. They stood in a corner by the punch table, unmoving for the entire 3-hour event. When someone asked one of the boys, Jules, if he wanted a cookie, he stared blankly and replied, "I've already been corrected today." No one knew what it meant. They laughed awkwardly. Evelyn smiled and changed the subject. Afterward, Jules was not seen in public again for 6 months. As more children appeared, whispers began, quiet, guarded. Who was funding all these adoptions? Where were the records? Why did no one recall seeing Evelyn or Harold travel? But every time doubt crept in, the Hemsworths gave back. A hospital wing was funded. New books were donated to the church library. Harold offered free neurological screenings to veterans. Evelyn hosted tea socials with clergy from across the county. And so the town convinced itself. They told themselves that the strange behavior was trauma, that silence was healing, that uniformity was care. They swallowed their doubts because the alternative was too disturbing to name. It wasn't until 1953, when Helen, one of the oldest children, spoke during a routine visit to the town dentist, that someone finally took notice. While Evelyn waited in the front room, Helen whispered to the hygienist, "My real name isn't Helen." She said it so quietly the woman thought she'd misheard. "Sorry?" The girl looked down. "It's Liesel Dornfeld, from Dresden." Then Evelyn appeared in the doorway. Helen went silent. The hygienist told the story to her husband, but the conversation never left their dinner table. They didn't want trouble. Still, it stuck in the woman's mind. She checked the name years later. Dornfeld. There was a Liesel Dornfeld. She'd gone missing in 1945. Age 6. No surviving family. No confirmed recovery. Helen looked about 13 when she came to Briar Glen. The timeline fit. The truth began to crystallize. But by then, no one knew where Helen had gone. The Hemsworths claimed she'd been returned to a relative in Maine. No one verified it. No one tried, and so the town looked away once more. Because it's easier to believe the lie of charity than confront the horror of complicity. Especially when the lie wears pearls and funds your hospital. Especially when the lie smiles in church. Especially when the lie thanks you for your silence. By 1956, there were only 5 children left in the Hemsworth home. And no one, not even the priests, could remember the names of the 5 who were gone. They never spoke. Not once in public. Not a single syllable. Not a whisper, a giggle, or even a cough. The Hemsworth children were silent like statues, as if something sacred, or something terrifying had demanded it of them. At first, people thought it was trauma. War orphans, after all. Maybe they were too scared, too damaged, too foreign to speak. The explanation sat well enough for the town. They repeated it to each other, nodding like they understood. "They've seen things," they'd say. "You can't expect them to act like regular children." But silence explains very little. It certainly doesn't explain what came next. Each child walked the same. Same posture, same pace, same spacing between footsteps. It was mechanical. You could have drawn blueprints from their formations. Neighbors who watched the Hemsworths from their windows, always from their windows, noticed the same sequence every day. Wake at dawn, file into the garden in 2 rows, circle the yard clockwise, then line up for some kind of inspection. Hands out, palms up. No talking, never talking. Even the smallest actions seemed mirrored. If one child scratched their ear, another followed within seconds. A cough would echo across 3 or 4 of them. It wasn't just strange, it was synchronized, rehearsed, as though they were performing for someone none of the townspeople could see. William Trask, the handyman, told his wife after a plumbing job at the Hemsworths' house that he'd never go back. "I've never been afraid of kids," he said, "but I swear to you, those kids, they were empty. Eyes like painted glass, not a single toy in the whole house, not one." Their bedrooms, he said, were identical. 2 sets of folded gray uniforms, 1 Bible, 1 blank notebook, no drawings, no books, no signs of personality. He said it felt more like a barracks than a home. He asked Evelyn once, half joking, "Don't they play outside?" She smiled with that tight, unmoving grin and said, "Play is earned." That same year, 1954, one of the girls, Beatrice, was seen alone in town for the first time. Evelyn had taken her along for a trip to the grocer and left her waiting by the door while she collected supplies. A young boy from the neighborhood, maybe 13, approached her. "You live on Briar Glen, right?" he asked. Beatrice didn't nod, didn't smile. "You okay?" he added gently. She looked him dead in the eye and said in a whisper almost inaudible, "We're not allowed to talk." Before he could respond, Evelyn was there. Her gloved hand gripped Beatrice's wrist, and the girl was led away. Neither said a word. Beatrice was never seen again. 2 weeks later, a typed note appeared on the church bulletin. "With God's grace, Beatrice has been returned to surviving relatives overseas." No further details. No goodbye party. No photographs. No questions. It became the pattern. Whenever a child spoke out of turn, they vanished, always with an excuse. Reunited with family. Taken in by cousins. Transferred to a private school. But no one ever followed up. The town had grown comfortable in its silence, and maybe a little complicit. Mrs. Lindstrom, the piano teacher, recalled volunteering to teach the children hymns. Evelyn declined, citing an alternative spiritual discipline already in place. But Mrs. Lindstrom persisted. Eventually, she was invited to observe their daily devotional. What she witnessed unsettled her deeply. At precisely 7 p.m., the children filed into the sitting room and knelt in a perfect circle around a small, wooden pedestal. One by one, they recited a series of phrases. Not prayers exactly, but instructions. Rules, corrections, the same phrases, repeated word for word, in the same order. Do not dream. Do not sing. Do not speak unless called. Their voices were flat, hollow. Mrs. Lindstrom never returned. Years later, when she was asked what disturbed her most, she said it wasn't the content, it was the coordination. Like they'd rehearsed it in a place where mistakes were punished. Father Doyle, the parish priest, attempted a private visit in 1955. Evelyn was courteous, as always. She offered tea. She showed him the children's study room, but when he asked to speak to one of them alone, her expression froze. "They're not permitted to speak individually," she said. "Not yet." Father Doyle returned to the rectory that night and wrote a letter to the diocese. He never sent it. Why? He never said. Months later, another child, Jules, was briefly spotted outside the post office with Harold. A store clerk claimed he tried to say something, started to, but Harold dropped his hand heavily on the boy's shoulder. The child went silent immediately. That was the last time anyone saw Jules. And yet, for all these red flags, the town said nothing. The Hemsworths were still donating, still attending Mass, still the perfect couple on paper. To speak against them felt like blasphemy, or worse, betrayal. And so the community continued to watch through their windows, making notes they would never share. Until, one autumn morning, a groundskeeper discovered faint pencil writing beneath the attic wallpaper during a maintenance check in 1982. The words were shaky, uneven. My name was Jules. I was not allowed to say it. Below it, in a child's hand, silence equals survival. 9 initials were found scratched in the same space. The townspeople had only ever known of 8 children. And still, the most damning discovery came from a detail easily missed. A local librarian cataloging old books from the Hemsworth estate found one of the children's notebooks tucked behind a Bible. It was nearly blank, but on the last page, in a careful, painstaking scrawl, one line was written over and over. "If I speak, I disappear." No one in Briar Glen ever saw the basement of the Hemsworth house. The doors were always locked, the windows blacked out. But when the property was seized in 1986, 4 decades after the adoptions began, authorities finally entered. What they found didn't resemble a family home. It was something else entirely. Beneath the floorboards, past a soundproofed stairwell, was a laboratory. Harold Hemsworth had converted the entire basement into what he called a therapeutic facility. The walls were lined with steel cabinets and surgical trays. Leather restraints were mounted to patient chairs. A strange machine, part EEG, part electroshock, sat in the center of the room, wires trailing like vines across the floor. Dozens of handwritten journals were found locked in a metal trunk. Each was stamped with Hemsworth's monogram. Each was filled with research that no hospital had ever approved, no university had ever reviewed, and no ethicist had ever signed off on. The journals detailed something he called memory pattern interruption. His theory, trauma, if rooted deeply enough, formed loops, neurological cycles that replayed endlessly in the subconscious. These loops, he believed, could be interrupted and eventually erased by destabilizing a subject's identity. In layman's terms, erase the person to erase the pain. The early experiments were performed on rats. Hemsworth used strobe patterns and sound frequencies to confuse basic behavior, paired with isolation and food conditioning. Over time, the rats became motionless, predictable, submissive, emotionally flat, as he described them. But rats, he wrote, were too limited. They couldn't reconstruct identity. For true breakthroughs, human subjects were necessary. Subjects emotionally volatile or pre-disassociated due to trauma were ideal. And where would he find such subjects? War orphans, children without families, children no one would ask about, children who had already learned silence. The adoption records were fake. That much became clear later. Each child was registered under vague aliases with forged paperwork. Birthplaces ranged from France to undisclosed. Most bore signs of relocation from Eastern Europe, where post-war chaos left hundreds unaccounted for. Inside the journals were charts tracking the children's reactions to various stimuli: light pulses, audio loops, electrodes, sedatives, sleep deprivation. Some pages were marked with names. EB shows no response to familial images. TH weeps when exposed to music, then ceases entirely after treatment for. J attempted speech, scheduled for session 9B. The same symbols repeated over and over. And a spiral. Photographs accompanied the entries. Grainy, black and white shots of children strapped to chairs. Faces obscured by helmets, wires clamped to temples. No notes of pain relief, no mention of comfort, only variables, only metrics. Outside the lab, the children continued their daily performance. Perfect posture, perfect silence, perfect obedience. But within the journals, the truth leaked through. One entry read, "Evelyn concerned about frequency of night terrors. Suggest limiting exposure time to visual feedback during second phase." Another, "Subject TH now exhibits tremors upon hearing own name. Promising." And another, "Subjects no longer dream. EEG shows flat activity during REM cycle. Emotional flattening confirmed." It wasn't healing, it was conditioning, stripping down the mind until only behavior remained. By 1960, the journals describe Phase 2, identity redirection. The idea wasn't just to erase trauma, but to replace it. To implant new loyalties, new belief systems. A blank child, after all, could be taught anything, could be turned into anyone. Evelyn assisted in this stage. Her role was reinforcement. Soft voice, repetition. Daily routines calibrated to reward absolute obedience. Discipline, when required, was calculated and dispassionate. Hemsworth noted, "His presence reinforces maternal loop, despite biological disconnection." But the success rate was low. Most children eventually collapsed into catatonia or exhibited violent side effects. Some stopped eating. Others began to self-mutilate in private. Evelyn labeled these cases as spiritually compromised and requested removal. Removal never meant relocation. It meant termination. At the bottom of one journal, under a section marked Failures, 10 names were listed. Next to each, a date, a session number, and the word Concluded. There were no graves on the Hemsworth property, but several concrete slabs in the basement, when lifted, revealed sealed compartments beneath. Police would later confirm they contained bones, child-sized, disarticulated, scrubbed clean. Some of the journals had been burned, but most were intact. Investigators believe Harold intended to publish, somehow, perhaps through his university contacts. One letter, never sent, was addressed to a former colleague in Zurich. It reads, "We've eliminated variance in behavioral compliance. Next phase is reintegration. Can one reinsert a cleansed child into society without detection? If so, we've solved more than trauma, we've solved identity itself." The phrase was underlined twice. One photograph, found taped inside the final journal, shows all 10 children standing in the basement lab, dressed in gray uniforms. No shoes, no expressions. Only one is looking directly at the camera. His eyes are wide, his mouth is open, but no sound ever came from the photograph. That boy, initials unknown, was never identified. The Church of St. Winifred had stood at the edge of Briar Glen since before the war. Quiet, ivy-covered, forgettable. Its basement was cluttered with boxes of hymnals, tattered choir robes, and forgotten records no one had touched in decades. In 1987, while organizing the archives for a parish anniversary event, a young volunteer named Amelia Cross came across an iron-bound wooden box tucked behind a false panel near the storage furnace. It was locked, but brittle with age. The hinges gave after a few hits with a candle holder. Inside, wrapped in wax paper, was a red leather ledger with brass corners. Embossed on the cover, H.H. The handwriting inside was unmistakably Harold Hemsworth's. At first glance, the ledger looked like a list of names, but as Amelia flipped through it, her unease grew. Each page was titled by year. Each year had 10 names, written in block letters. No surnames, just first names or initials. Some matched the names whispered in Briar Glen folklore. Beatrice, Jules, Theb, Miri. Next to each name was a number, sometimes 2, 7.2b or 4.1a. Alongside those, in a neat final column, a single word: recalibrated. No adoption agencies were listed. No dates of birth. No legal sign-offs. No parent signatures. Nothing official. Nothing legal. Some pages included strange codes in Latin. One particularly chilling entry: Amor silentium, obedientia sine causa, cognitio redempta, love silence, obedience without reason, memory redeemed. It wasn't a ledger of adoptions. It was a log of human experiments. At the bottom of the 1953 page was a different phrase, hastily scrawled in black ink: Initiative stable. Readiness 93%. New selection approved. Below that, a separate list began. 11 names this time. Only 4 were crossed out. No explanation. No outcomes. Amelia took the ledger directly to the local police. She handed it to Officer Langston, expecting urgency. Action, an investigation. She was told to wait. 2 days later, the ledger was returned to her, gently, respectfully, but with a different tone. "We looked into it," Langston said. "What you found appears to be notes from Dr. Hemsworth's pastoral counseling work, probably a list of prayer intentions or private therapy cases. Nothing actionable." Amelia pushed back. "There are names of missing children in here," she insisted. "Kids no one ever filed paperwork for. People still talk about them." Langston held up his hand. "There's nothing we can do unless there's proof of a crime, and I'd advise you not to stir up old pain without reason." She left, furious and afraid. Later that evening, someone broke into her car. Nothing was stolen, but the glove compartment had been emptied, the trunk unlatched. The next morning, she found a note pinned to her apartment door. "Let what is past remain buried. The living are fragile." She moved to another town within the month, but not before photocopying every page of the ledger. Decades later, one of those copies resurfaced in a university archive tied to a lecture series on institutional ethics. The professor who presented it, Dr. Elias Mahoney, connected it to unverified Cold War experiments on child conditioning in both the US and Europe. He suggested the Hemsworths may have been linked to a shadow network of behavior modification researchers embedded in medical and religious institutions. He was discredited within the year and lost tenure, but the documents remained. A later analysis of the ledger revealed further anomalies. Each name was associated with a number sequence resembling session logs or treatment levels. Some showed revisions, as if a subject had failed and been reassigned a new protocol. Names that weren't crossed out had a small dot next to them. Only 3 names were like that. In 1996, a retired nurse from a Boston psychiatric facility saw one of the ledger pages in a documentary still. "I know that name," she said. She pointed to the initials JM and the date 1958. "That's Jonah. He came in during the 70s, quiet boy. never spoke, carried a Bible, had a number tattooed behind his left ear, 7.3C. She remembered the number because it was neatly, almost surgically printed, not like a prison or camp tattoo, more like a label. Jonah died in 1981. Cause of death: cardiac arrest during electroconvulsive therapy. The hospital had no prior records of his life before admission. No birth certificate, no known family. Another dot, another unfinished page. Back in Briar Glen, the ledger is still unofficially referred to as the Book of Ghosts. Those who've seen it whisper about the pattern: 10 children per year. Replaced, reprocessed, recalibrated. Over time, the questions faded. The town stopped talking. But every now and then, someone new shows up in the archives. Quiet, curious, always asking the same thing: why were there no adoption papers? The answer never changes. Because they weren't adopted, they were acquired. And someone, somewhere, had been keeping score. It began as a routine archival review. In 1972, Margaret LeClaire, a young social worker for the Massachusetts Office of Child Welfare, was tasked with digitizing a backlog of post-war adoption records. Most were poorly kept, scattered across aging boxes and riddled with missing pages. But tucked into one unmarked folder, hidden between letters and index cards, she found a photograph. Black and white, faded, glossy paper curling at the corners. A group of 10 children, all standing in a rigid line at what appeared to be a church fair in 1952. They wore matching outfits: dark wool coats, buttoned to the top, and heavy leather shoes. Boys and girls alike indistinguishable at first glance. But one detail halted Margaret's breath. The girl third from the left was not like the others. While the rest stared blankly or downward, her eyes were fixed on the camera, wide, terrified, almost pleading. Her mouth was slightly open, as if caught mid-breath, her hands clenched into fists. Something about her posture, her frozen fear, made Margaret sit down. She couldn't explain why, but that face was not like the others. On the back of the photo, only one note: St. Winifred's Jubilee, 1952. No names, no photographer, no agency listed. Margaret brought the image to her supervisor, who dismissed it as just another parish event. But Margaret couldn't let it go. She began scanning the image into the office's new microfiche database, tagging it for possible follow-up. Just to be safe. That night, she had a dream. Not about the girl, not about the Hemsworths, but about her own childhood. Lost memories of being 6 years old, hiding in a closet while her father shouted down the hallway. It came out of nowhere, a memory long buried. The next day, Margaret made it personal. She began cross-referencing the image with school district records from Briar Glen between 1950 and 1955. Yearbooks, class photos, teacher rosters. She used facial matching to try to identify any of the 10 children. None of them appeared in any official enrollment records. Not a single child had been registered at the public or Catholic schools. No vaccinations, no report cards, no Sunday school logs. They existed in the photograph, but nowhere else. Then came the breakthrough. While reviewing a database of international wartime displacement records, Margaret began entering the faces into a facial comparison system. Primitive by today's standards, but capable of flagging potential matches. It pinged. The girl with the terrified eyes matched a photo from a 1944 missing child bulletin issued in Belgium. Name: Anna DeWitt. Age: 4. Last seen during a Red Cross evacuation in Antwerp. Her mother had been killed in the bombing. No surviving records after the war. The photo from 1944 showed Anna in a striped dress, standing next to her brother. She smiled in that image, brightly, innocently. 8 years later, the girl in Briar Glen no longer smiled. Margaret submitted a formal inquiry to Interpol and Belgian Child Services. Weeks passed, then months. A sealed envelope arrived in the mail. Inside, a brief letter from Brussels. The DeWitt case had been considered closed due to presumed death, but the officer confirmed the facial structure match was highly probable. They had no leads, no suspects. The war had made everything vanish. Margaret returned to the parish. She asked the current priest, Father Redman, about the 1952 fair. He was new, barely 30, and had no memory of it, but he allowed her to search the archives. What she found horrified her. There were no photos of the fair in the parish's official scrapbook. Only one flyer remained: St. Winifred's Jubilee, sponsored by Dr. H. Hemsworth and Mrs. E. Hemsworth, families welcome. But not a single parishioner remembered attending. Margaret started knocking on doors in Briar Glen. Most were reluctant. Many were silent. But one woman, Elaine Marston, now in her 70s, spoke up. "I remember that girl," she said. "Only one who looked scared. Rest of them moved like puppets, always gave me chills." Elaine had attended the fair briefly, but left after 20 minutes. "There was something wrong," she whispered. "Those kids didn't blink, didn't speak. I asked Evelyn once why they were so quiet. She said, 'Quiet is healing.'" Margaret returned to her office and began compiling everything. The photograph, the adoption voids, the Belgium file. She wrote a report nearly 80 pages long and submitted it to the state's legal department. It was dismissed. "Without concrete proof of wrongdoing," the letter read, "we have no jurisdiction to investigate the Hemsworth estate or affiliated parties." Weeks later, Margaret was reassigned to a different department, juvenile behavioral cases. Her supervisor called it a promotion. She knew it was a warning, but she kept a copy of the photograph, always tucked in her desk drawer. Some nights, she swore the girl's eyes had changed, that they were following her now. In 1981, long after Margaret had left social work, she received a call from a journalist working on a book about Cold War experimentation. "How do you know Anna DeWitt?" he asked. She froze. The man claimed he had been researching orphan trafficking in post-war Europe and stumbled upon a cluster of unsolved child disappearance cases, many tied to religious missions or medical research centers. One name kept recurring: Hemsworth. He'd found Margaret's old report, buried in state records, marked inconclusive. Together, they began looking deeper. They found that 3 other children from the 1952 photo also had potential European matches. One from Czechoslovakia, another from Poland, all displaced, all presumed dead, all matched to children adopted by Harold and Evelyn Hemsworth. By then, the Hemsworth house had long since been boarded up, the labs removed, the records scattered. But the photograph remained. In 2002, that same image was presented during a symposium on post-war atrocities at the University of Ghent. A woman in the audience fainted. When revived, she claimed her sister had disappeared in 1944 during a Red Cross transport. She pointed to the girl in the photograph. "That's Anna," she wept. "She called me Lisette. No one believed me." She was 72 years old. No one ever found Anna's body. But the photograph, now enlarged and framed, sits behind glass in an exhibit titled "The Lost Faces of Briar Glen." 10 children, one girl who looked back, and the question that still burns: what did she see when the camera flashed? It began in 1986 in a small therapy office outside Providence, Rhode Island. Dr. Helen Margrave, a licensed trauma counselor, had taken on a new patient, Clara Jennings, a quiet woman in her late 30s with a long history of anxiety, dissociation, and fragmented memory. Clara had never spoken of her childhood in detail. Her medical files mentioned night terrors, chronic insomnia, and a recurring phrase she scribbled in notebooks during episodes of catatonia. The floor creaked above the doctor's study. Margrave initially attributed it to a symbolic trauma response, but in their 7th session, Clara broke her silence. "My mother worked in a big house once," she said, eyes unfocused. "A quiet place, too quiet." Dr. Margrave asked what house. "I don't know the name," Clara said, "but I remember the attic." Clara described being taken to the property as a child while her mother cleaned. She was told not to explore, not to ask questions, but she'd wander upstairs drawn by noises, faint tapping, breathing, whimpers. "There was a room," she said, "at the top of the stairs behind a door with no handle." Clara remembered peeking through a broken slat. Inside, dim light. Children sitting on the floor, all dressed the same, staring at nothing. One rocked slowly, another pressed her face to the wall, all silent, all but one. "She came close to the door," Clara whispered, and said, "I don't know my name." Then she backed away, and the others watched her go. Clara had told no one. Her mother had caught her moments later, dragged her downstairs and slapped her so hard she fell. She was forbidden to speak of it again. Dr. Margrave recorded the session as usual. She wrote the phrase in her notes. "I don't know my name." It struck her as familiar, hauntingly so. A week later, she called Clara back, asked about the house's location. Clara didn't know, but recalled that the walls were lined with dark wood. The kitchen smelled like antiseptic, and there was a portrait of a man in uniform, glasses, cold eyes. Margrave filed the memory away. 10 years later, in 1996, Dr. Margrave was invited to a closed symposium on historical trauma research, hosted by the New England Psychological Society. There, a young historian presented a paper on the Hemsworth estate, its history, the adoption records, the photograph, the rumors of treatment rooms, and memory manipulation. Margrave's blood ran cold. She approached the historian afterward and asked one question. "Did the house have an attic room?" He blinked. "Not in the original blueprints, but we found a concealed stairwell behind the upstairs linen closet. Led to a sealed door, room was empty, but the floor showed scratch marks, and the walls were reinforced." She told him about Clara, about the whisper, about the portrait. The historian showed her a picture of Dr. Harold Hemsworth. Glasses, cold eyes. It was the man in the uniform. Margrave later obtained permission to recontact Clara, now in her late 40s. Clara was reluctant but agreed to meet. She stared at the photograph of the estate for a long time. "It's cleaner now," she said, "but that's the place." When shown a lineup of faces, including the photo of the 1952 children, she pointed without hesitation. "That's the girl who spoke." The historian leaned in. "Are you sure?" Clara nodded. She had a red mark on her cheek, like a burn, and eyes that didn't blink. Margrave asked if she remembered the girl's name. Clara shook her head. She didn't have one, that's what she said. In 2003, when new investigative material was being compiled for a public report on unethical post-war research in New England, Margrave submitted her notes and the recording of Clara's session. It was filed into the official archive under the label Subject 7, The Whispering Girl. Though Clara never remembered the exact location of the estate, Her testimony matched over a dozen anonymous tips from former parish volunteers and hospital staff who claimed to have seen silent children transported between the Hemsworth property and a private wing at Mercy Hill Asylum. One nurse, under the condition of anonymity, said, "They never spoke, but they watched you like they knew something you didn't, like they were remembering something they'd been told to forget." In 2008, the attic room was officially entered during a state-funded investigation into the property, now abandoned and crumbling. Behind the hidden door, forensic teams found scratched initials in the floorboards. Most were partial, but one name, burned faintly into the wall with what appeared to be a soldering tool, read Anna. Below it, carved in smaller letters, "I don't know my name." The discovery made headlines briefly, then disappeared from coverage. Clara never sought compensation. She refused interviews. She passed away in 2015 from pancreatic cancer, leaving behind no family and a single journal filled with repeated lines. It was real. I remember the girl. She didn't blink. Dr. Margrave kept the journal. And to this day, she visits the archive once a year, placing a rose at the sealed file marked Hemsworth Attic Room, Testimonies. The photograph still hangs nearby, and if you stand quietly in the darkened hall, some say you can hear it. A voice behind the glass, barely a whisper. "I don't know my name." In the winter of 1994, a box mislabeled as Cognitive Training Materials 1950s arrived at the Massachusetts Historical Preservation Office. It sat unopened for months on a shelf in the private archive wing, nearly discarded during a routine records purge. But Dr. Elaine Rutledge, a quiet archivist with a habit of double-checking everything, felt something off about the weight of the box. Too heavy for paper, too tightly sealed for something meant for casual education. She opened it. Inside, stacked carefully and wrapped in waxed cloth, were 13 metal reels. Each was labeled by hand in fading ink, not with course codes or academic titles, but names. Nathaniel, 1959. Petra, 1950. Annalise, 1948. And again, Anna, 1952. Dr. Rutledge took 3 reels home over the weekend. She played them on her restored Bell and Howell. The silence hit first, then the stillness, then the order. Each reel opened the same way. A date card, a clinical note. Then a child seated in a chair, posture perfect, expression blank. On one reel, a little boy is asked to recite the alphabet. He stops at the letter G, repeats it 5 times, then begins weeping, silently, without movement. Another reel labeled Evelyn 1954 includes chalkboard diagrams behind the child. Bullet points read, "Empathic resonance dampened. Linguistic regression complete. Emotional recall null." The most disturbing reel was labeled Lena post-op. It begins mid-session. A young girl sits upright, holding a violin. She stares at the instrument like it's a foreign object. A voice off-screen instructs her to play. She raises the bow, places it incorrectly. The sound she produces is dissonant, confused. The off-screen voice, flat and male, asks, "Do you know what you're playing?" Lena whispers, "No." Another voice, female this time, "What is music?" Lena blinks, then answers, "Something others hear." She sets the violin down, turns toward the camera, and smiles. The reel ends. Dr. Rutledge didn't sleep that night. Over the next week, she screened 4 more reels, all documented procedures, progress charts, even directives like disrupt familial imprinting. Test response to removed moral triggers. Evaluate utility post-cleansing. One reel, Edgar, 1947, contained what looked like brainwave scans. The voice in the background discusses flattening unnecessary spikes associated with self-reference. Another reel logs a girl who once spoke 6 languages, now unable to name her own mother. Then, on a reel dated 1952, a clip of Anna. She stares at her own reflection in a hand mirror, repeating, "This is not me, this is not me, this is not me," for 5 straight minutes. What Dr. Rutledge did next may have cost her everything. She printed stills, archived timestamps, sent a brief to a university colleague in Belgium, someone with access to missing persons reports from the war. The colleague responded in shock. The children matched names from the Belgian registry, orphans who disappeared between 1944 and 1945. Anna, Petra, and Edgar were among them. The next day, Dr. Rutledge contacted a local journalist. She made plans to copy the reels. She never made it to the meeting. On February 23, 1994, she was reported missing by her sister. Her car was found parked outside the archive. Her belongings untouched. The reels gone. Only one thing remained in her desk drawer, an envelope marked "in case something happens." Inside were 6 printed screenshots. One shows the chalkboard list. One shows Lena holding the violin. One shows Anna staring into the mirror. And one shows a gloved hand lowering a needle toward a boy's temple. These screenshots now reside in an anonymous archive, maintained by a private researcher who refuses to go on record. All government inquiries into Dr. Rutledge's disappearance cite no foul play. The case is closed, but the images remain. And those who've seen them say the same thing. The eyes of the children don't look confused. They look empty, as if whatever was once inside had been taken. And the question that haunts every frame isn't what was done to them, but how many times has it been done since? In the spring of 2003, a frail woman was processed through the border facility at Fort Frances, Ontario. She had no passport, no known nationality. She gave her name as Clara Delane, though no record of such a person existed. What she did have was a folded, grease-stained piece of paper, a drawing. Done in pencil and trembling lines, it depicted 10 children standing in front of a house on fire. Their expressions were hollow. Their arms were linked. At the center of the drawing, towering behind them, was a man in a lab coat and a woman with black eyes and no mouth. When asked by border officials what the picture meant, Clara whispered, "We weren't born. We were made." She was immediately flagged and sent to a psychiatric facility in Winnipeg. There, she underwent preliminary evaluation. The attending physician described her as intelligent but dissociated, carrying memories like landmines. She repeated fragments of sentences during sleep studies. "The red pills make you forget. The chair smells like metal. And God. Don't speak or they come." But then came the real shock. Standard intake included a DNA swab, uploaded automatically to international records. 2 weeks later, an alert triggered. Clara Delane's mitochondrial DNA was a 99.9% match with Lena Verschutten, a Belgian girl who disappeared in 1945 at age 7. Within 48 hours, the Canadian facility was contacted by Interpol. 2 more matches were found, Anna Bloomer and Petra Hofstra, both listed as vanished from war-torn Europe during the mid-1940s. Both declared legally dead in 1951. Clara, in some impossible way, was all 3. Documents surfaced, pages handwritten by Dr. Elaine Rutledge in '94, before she vanished. Among her notes was a reference to subject convergence theory, an experiment in identity compression. Layering multiple personalities, languages, and memories into a single mind through chemical erasure and neurological imprinting. According to Rutledge, one child, Lena APV, survived longer than expected. She wrote, "Some part of her resists. Even after the treatments, she sings lullabies in 3 languages. She asks for sisters who were never recorded. Her mind is leaking ghosts." Now, nearly 60 years later, that ghost had walked into a border station with a drawing and a name that didn't exist. Canadian officials quietly denied Clara's asylum, but she was not deported. Instead, she was transferred to a high-security psychiatric research wing under the guise of long-term care. One nurse, who worked with Clara for 6 months before quitting without notice, claimed she once found Clara awake at 3 a.m., cutting the hem of her bedsheet into small ribbons. Each ribbon had a name written in pencil: Edgar, Petra, Annalise, Nathaniel, Evelyn. When the nurse asked what they were, Clara smiled and replied, "Labels they tried to burn. I remember them all." In September 2003, an independent journalist investigating the Hemsworth fire contacted the facility to inquire about Clara's status. The response was blunt: "No such patient exists." But the journalist had something no official could erase: one of Rutledge's screenshots. It showed a young nurse in a surgical mask assisting a doctor beside a patient strapped to a table. The date scrawled in the corner: October 1989. When run through facial recognition software, the nurse's features produced a 94% match to Evelyn Hemsworth, presumed dead in the 1981 fire. Same eyes, same scar beneath the lip, same expressionless stare. If true, it meant Evelyn had survived the fire, changed identities, and continued her work. Clara's final journal entry, transcribed by a social worker before she lapsed into silence for good, reads, "They think they ended it in fire, but fire doesn't kill ghosts. I see their faces in mirrors. I see their hands in doctors' gloves. They moved underground, they changed names, but they didn't stop. We are still here." To this day, no government body has acknowledged Clara Delane, the reals, or the experiments. The facility where Clara was housed was quietly shuttered in 2011. The staff reassigned, the records sealed. But one nurse kept a copy of Clara's drawing. She framed it, hung it above her daughter's bed, and every night, before turning out the light, she reads the caption Clara scrawled on the back: "If one remembers, none are gone." Let me know if you'd like a cinematic cold open, thumbnail title, or image generation prompt based on this script.